And welcome back. We have been reading The Quest by David Thompson, and in chapter 1, we wanted to know, first of all, who was the rider on the horse. Well, we come to find that the rider on the horse who was riding so desperately that he almost lost his own life was none other than Scott Kendall. Now, Scott Kendall is Nate King's good friend. And out in the wilderness in the Wild Wild West, people didn't really have a lot of friends, if you will. And so the ones they did come by, they held them close like family. And we're going to get into chapter 2 because we know that Scott Kendall has come within like an inch of his life, right? In chapter 1, Nate risked his own life trying to make certain that Scott Kendall was brought to safety. All right, so we're going to go on and get into chapter 2. Louisa May Clark had known the King family a relatively short time, yet in that brief span, she had come to regard them as rather remarkable. Besides being so close knit and considerate of one another, they were some of the bravest people she'd ever met. She was given another example of their courage as the grizzly started down the slope towards them. Now, the question for chapter 2 is, where is Nate? Right? For chapter 2, we want to know where Nate is, right? And so we're continuing to talk about this grizzly that um, they had an encounter with in chapter 1. Did either Nate or Zach show the slightest fear? They did not. They faced the monster as calmly as she would a stray dog, acting as if it were nothing to get excited about, as if having a grizzly interested in devouring them was the most normal occurrence on the face of the earth. Her future father in law seemed more annoyed than anything else. Unslinging his hawken, which is a gun, he sidled to the right for a clear shot, careful not to dislodge the tailless. Zack had put himself between her and the bear, an act that endeared him to her all the more. He was so protective. When they first met, it had bothered her some. She was a grown girl. She could take care of herself. But then she realized he was doing it out of love. Not out of any urge to run roughshod over her. And she had come to accept his protectiveness. She imagined that when they were married, he would do the same, but she wouldn't mind as long as he didn't turn into one of those men who treated their wives like helpless babies. And some friends of Paul had done just that. At that moment, unknown to her, Zach King was regretting that Lou had tagged along. He'd wanted to leave her at the cabin with his mother and sister, but she insisted on coming and he couldn't bring himself to refuse. Things would change once they were man and wife. Then he could speak more freely, and he would be damned if he would let any wife of his put herself in harm's way. For their mutual peace of mind, once they had their own place, it would be best if she stayed close to home. Nate King pressed his hawking to his shoulder, but didn't fire. At that range, he'd only wound the beast. And a wounded grizzly was a ferocious demon, unstoppable unless struck in a vital organ, which was hard to do thanks to their thick skulls and hides. As Lewis and Clark had learned on their famous expedition, dropping a grizz took grit, perseverance, and plenty of ammunition. The bear halted short of the upper edge of the Taylor's field. It sniffed suspiciously, perhaps disturbed by lingering dust. Its enormous head swung from side to side as if the bear were seeking a safe way down. Apparently, it had dealings with Taylor's before. Nate wasn't worried yet. He'd slain more than his share of the great bears. When he initially came to the Rockies, the mountains literally crawled with them, and every other month or so, he'd be pitted in combat with one. It had earned him a name unique among whites. To the Shoshones and the Crows, the Flatheads and the Utes, the Cheyennes and Arapahoes, he was known as Grizzly Killer. As the years went by, as more and more trappers flocked to the mountains, the number of silver tips along the foothills and the lower slopes dwindled. But those in the high alpine region of the Rockies were as numerous and formidable as ever. Nate sighted along the Hawken. The grizzly was prowling to the left, nose low to the soil. Nate speculated it was trying to pick up their scent in the mistaken belief it could descend the same way they had. Little did he know, he saw the brute start on to the talus, then draw up short when its paws dislodged a torrent. Backpedaling, it regained solid footing and snorted in irritation. Want me to fire a shot to try and scare it off? Zach asked. He was well aware that grizzlies were fearless, but he didn't want the bear getting any close, not with Lou present. No, stalking coyote, Nate said, using Zach's Shoshone name. Maybe it will just go away, Louisa said. Zach almost laughed out loud. Grizzlies never gave up. The idea was ridiculous, but he didn't say so to Lou for fear of offending her. Quite a bit of late, he found himself choking down words he might otherwise say just to spare her feelings, and he took it for granted that was normal when two people were in love. Rumbling deep in its huge barrel chest, the grizzly had climbed to the crest and was gazing at them. Silhouetted against the sky, it appeared almost regal, yet incredibly sinister. Turning, it shambled off down the other side. See, Lou said happily. What did I tell you? We're safe now. Are we? Nate asked himself, and reslung the Hawken over his right shoulder. Work fast, he commanded, acutely conscious of every passing second. He resumed their descent, moving with less care than before, anxious to reach the bottom. so anxious that when the dirt slid from under him, he didn't stop. Louisa sensed the mountain man's urgency and divined the reason. She checked behind them several times, but the grizzly hadn't reappeared. Nate was unduly concerned, she reflected. They weren't in any danger. Why would the bear go to all the trouble to travel completely around the ridge? It was the blood, Nate was thinking. Kendall's freshly spilled blood. The grizzly had caught a whiff of it, and the monster's bestial instincts had been inflamed. Their only hope to avoid a possible fatal clash was to mount up and get out of there before the silver tip returned. One of the horses weaned, and all four, their ears erected and were fidgeting nervously. Lou's mare, worst of all. The babe was staring at the west end of the ridge, 200 yards away. What's got them so skittish? Louisa asked, the answer occurring to her the moment the words were out of her mouth. Oh, she said, and felt foolish. It's going to come after us, isn't it? Yes, Zack said. He knew they would be lucky to escape unharmed. A grizzly's ferocity and cunning were matched only by its single minded determination in pursuit of prey. Once a bear began a stalk, it didn't like to quit until its fangs were buried in its quarry. A low roar from the west end of the ridge was added incentive for them to hurry. Nate reckoned it was a young Bruin. An older grizzly would know better than to let them know where it was. He kicked a large rock from his path, avoided an eddy of swirling dirt, and drew within a dozen yards of the bottom. It'll be awful close, Pa, Zack said. What will? Louisa asked. Zack didn't answer. He was surprised she didn't realize their plight. Granted, she had little wilderness savvy, but he would hope his wife to be was sharp enough to think things through for herself. Not that he would adore her any less. Still, Nate went a little too fast and paid for his mistake by having his moccasins wrenched out from under him. He fell onto his knees, pain searing up his thighs to his lower back. Undaunted, he shoved erect, firmed his grip, and partially walked, partially slid the final few feet. The whole while, Scott Kendall never stirred. His breathing was regular but shallow, half his face caked with drying blood. Nate saw that his son and Lou were winded. He could use a short breather himself, but an overriding sense of urgency spurred him into moving toward the horses without setting the trouble down. Well, we'll throw Scott over the sorrel, he announced. Oh, oh God, Lou exclaimed. The bear was at the far end of the ridge. It stared for only a moment, then broke into a shuffling trot, moving with amazing swiftness for so large an animal. Its bulk was deceptive. At top speed, a grizzly could overtake a horse. If you're just tuning in, we are reading chapter 2 of The Quest by David Thompson. Pure fright gushed through Lou. She had to will her arms and legs to work to help Stalking Coyote and his father lift Kendall and ease him onto the saddle, belly down. It took valuable seconds, seconds in which the bear drew rapidly nearer. When next she looked, the grizzly had slashed the distance by half. Another 100 yards and it would be on top of them. Lou's fright grew worse, nearly paralyzing her. Light a shock, Nate declared, pushing both of them toward their respective mounts. Zach, you lead the sorrel. Without waiting to see if they obeyed, Nate sprang onto the bay, hauled on the reins, and did the last thing any sane person would do. He rode toward the grizzly instead of away from it. What's your pa doing? Louisa asked. Saving our lives. Zach was already astride his don. Don't dawdle or we're goners. Lou didn't like his tone, but she climbed on and followed as he wheeled and trotted off. Within seconds, they were in among the pines, and she felt a bit safer. At least the bear couldn't see them. Nate King didn't resort to his hawking. At a full gallop, he bore down on the grizzly, which never slackened speed, gaping jaws wide, slavering with bloodthirst. It was almost upon him when Nate swerved, flying past almost within reach of its paws. As he went by, he uttered a Shoshone whoop. The ruse succeeded. The bear forgot all about Zach and Louisa and came after him. Nate had counted on luring the bear away. What he hadn't counted on was his uncanny quickness. It was on him within heartbeats, its forepaws racking the bay's tail, nearly shredding its flanks. The bay spurted forward, nickering, and from then on they were in a race for their lives, with bristling death at their heels. The grizz gnashed empty air, eager to bring them down. Its claws clipped the bay's tail again. Nate risked one quick glance to be sure Zach and Lou were gone. Then he cut to the left toward the ridge. When the bear did likewise, Nate reversed directions, angling toward the firs. It bought him a few extra yards, yards that might mean the difference between seeing his wife again and being turned into worm food. Bent low, he streaked into the woods without any regard for his safety. A low limb nearly took his head off. Another gouged his shoulder, almost unseating him. Plowing through the undergrowth as if it didn't exist, the grizzly glued itself to the bay. It sounded like a steam engine about to explode, its paws thudding like the beat of a Cheyenne drum. A narrow opening between a pair of saplings gave Nate an idea. Reining sharply, he sped between them with barely enough room to spare. He thought the barrier would slow the grizzly down, but he was wrong. They hardly gave it pause. The bear slammed into them with the force of a battering ram, snapping both as if they were dry twigs. A log hove into sight, and Nate made straight for it. The bay, well trained, sailed up and over without breaking stride. To Nate's chagrin, the grits did the same, displaying astounding agility. It was a vivid demonstration, as if any were needed, of why so many trappers and Indians had lost their lives to the lords of the Rockies. They underestimated what those beasts were capable of. Nate had suffered from the same flaw when he was still green behind the ears. Back then, there had been so much for him to learn that mountain lions could leap 20 feet from a standing start, that buffalo would stampede at the click of a rifle hammer, that wolverines deserved their reputation for wanton savagery, that grizzlies were harder to kill than all of them combined. Swiveling, Nate considered putting a ball into the beast's head. It might slow the silver tip long enough for him to escape. A thicket loom, half an acre of dense brush. Ordinarily, Nate would give it a wide berth to spare the bay from scratches and scrapes. But now he plunged on in, lashing the reins, and true to form, the grizzly barreled in after him. Nate slanted to one side, then the other. Each time he gained a few critical feet on his adversary, who wasn't adept at adapting to abrupt changes in direction. And two, the bear had slowed a trifle to spare its eyes from the scores of thin limbs the bay broke, the tips thrusting like needles at its face. Exploding into the open, Nate bore due west, leading the grizzly away from the cabin, away from his family. It surprised him the brute wasn't flagging yet. While silvertips were fast when they needed to be, they lacked endurance. After a quarter of a mile or so, they tired and could run no farther. Not this one, snorting hideously. It sought to regain the ground it had lost. Its long, thick claws sheared at the bay's legs. It seemed that nothing short of the grizzly's death would stop it. Nate racked his brain for a means of escaping in one piece. Grabbing hold of his bouncing powder horn, he did his best to hold it steady while opening it. Then, upended the horn over his other palm. Half the powder spilled onto his legs and saddle, but he clenched the hand and swiveled. The grizzly was going all out, its mouth wider than ever, sucking air into its heaving lungs. Its massive wedge-shaped head rose, and it locked baleful eyes on him. Have a taste, Nate said, and flung the black powder. Some missed. More got into the bear's mouth and eyes. The hairy colossal snapped his jaws several times, then shook his head as if it had taken a bite of something it didn't like. Like it? Nate taunted and threw another handful. Black powder was toxic and wouldn't do more than give the brute a mild bellyache, but it tasted positively awful. And when it got in the eyes, it stung worse than salt. Nate hurled a third handful, hoping his gamble paid off. He had used up most of his powder, and he had only the one shot in the hawking, which is his gun. If the bear caught him, he wouldn't last 5 seconds. A Green River knife was no match for over 1,000 pounds of unbridled brawn and a bristling arsenal of teeth and claws. The bear was snorting as if it had a cork stuck up its nose. It slowed and tossed its head, and for a few moments Nate believed his ploy had worked. Then the grizzly roared and came at him with renewed fury. You're pacing, Ma. Are you worried? Winona King halted in mid stride and glanced at her daughter, seated on the edge of the bed against the wall. No, she fibbed, and felt guilty for doing so. It was not the Shoshone way of life, but she wanted to spare her daughter's needless anxiety. In truth, Winona was worried enough for both of them. Evelyn wasn't fooled. Oh, don't fret. Whatever it is, Pa can handle it. What can hurt him? Many things, Winona thought to herself. Her husband was stronger than most and wiser than many, but he wasn't invincible. Their offspring's confidence notwithstanding, Winona had to remind herself it was normal for children to believe their parents could. What was the expression the whites used? Oh, yes, it was normal for children to believe their parents could walk on water. To someone of Evelyn's tender years, a parent was all knowing and all powerful. One of the greatest shocks a child experienced was to learn their mother and father were only human. I wish I could have gone with Zach and Lou, Evelyn mentioned. Like Winona, she wore a buckskin dress lavishly decorated with beads and red fridge her mother had traded for at Bent's Fort. Her hair was as black as Winona's, but cut shorter, shoulder length, eyes sparkling. Evelyn hopped down and came to the doorway. You'll wear a rut in the floor. Despite herself, Winona laughed. Her daughter was developing a fine sense of humor. Winona took pride in how both of her children were turning out, but it hadn't always been so. But Louisa came along. Winona had been deeply worried about stalking Coyote. The hatred the boy had endured due to his mixed lineage had spawned bitter resentment. Resentment she'd been afraid would one day erupt in violence if her son didn't learn to deal with it maturely. Did you hear something, Ma? Evelyn asked. What? Winona had been too deep in thought. Opening the door, she stepped outside, her hands resting on the flint logs tucked under her beaded belt. Evelyn rose onto her toes and screened her eyes with a hand. I don't see them anywhere. Too many trees, Winona said. Do you think it's a war party? I don't know. It could be the Utes, but they're friendly now, aren't they? Maybe those mean old Bloods again. I don't. Or the Blackfeet. They're still mad at Pa over that fight up on the Yellowstone. Reckon they tried to sneak up on us? I or maybe it's some bad whites, like the ones who tried to make wolf meat of all of us a while ago. You don't think some of their kin have hunted us down, do you, Ma? Winona inwardly counted to 10. As dearly as she adored her daughter, there were times when Blue Flower tried her patience. Ever since the girl was old enough to talk, she had been one giant question mark. Well, we'll have to wait and find out. We could saddle up and go have a look see. I'll even bring the horses around while you fetch the rifle. So that's what this is leading up to? Winona sighed. Her children had a devious streak she liked to say came from their father, but the fact of the matter was that her husband didn't have a deceitful bone in his handsome body. Nate was too forthright and honorable for his own good sometimes. Winona, however, was quite crafty, a trait she came by honestly. From an early age, Shoshone girls were taught to hone their wits, both for dealing with men and for surviving in a world where nearly every other tribe considered them an enemy. Oh, shucks, Ma. Evelyn wasn't pleased. I can't wait until I'm old enough to do as I want. Like Lou, she comes and goes as she sees fit. She, she, she gets to stay up late like the rest of you. When I'm 16, I'll do the same. You will not. How's that, Ma? So long as you live in this cabin, you will respect our wishes. Louisa has more freedom because she isn't our daughter. She won't be part of the family until she marries your brother, and then she'll be his wife and will be and she'll be treated like every other adult. Evelyn scratched her head. She gets to do as she wants because she isn't your daughter? I don't get it. I don't get to do what I want. Yes, exactly. That's not fair. Life isn't fair. It never treats two people the same. One person might enjoy many years of health and happiness, another might be torn apart by a cougar at an early age. Why is that? Evelyn's brow knit. Remember last week when Paul was reading from the Bible? He said that God loves all of us. So, how can God let one person be so happy and have the other suffer? Winona hesitated. To her people, the ways of the great mystery were just that, a mystery no one could penetrate. She recalled how amazed she had been when Nate showed her the white man's holy book. Whites had always struck her as bold, even arrogant, but never in her wildest imaginings would she think they were arrogant enough to put God on paper. After Nate taught her to read, she had studied the holy book and seen that her judgment had been hasty. Some parts of it she didn't quite comprehend, but other parts were ripe with beauty and insight. How can he? Evelyn pressed her. Bad things happen to good people all the time. Winona began and was interrupted again, although not by her daughter. From out of the woods trotted her son and Louisa, leading a third horse over which a body had been thrown. Fearing it was the man who claimed her heart, Winona dashed forward, stopping when she noticed his hair. That is not Nate. Zach drew reins at the corral. No, it's Scott Kendall, Ma. He took a spill and split his noggin. Paul says he won't last long without your help. Winona gazed into the pines. Where's your father? Louisa answered. Last we saw, a grizzly was after him. He was leading it off so it wouldn't attack us. I don't mind telling you, Mrs. King, that he has more sand than most tin men I've known. Zach, for a reason he couldn't fathom, felt himself grow as hot as a glowing ember in their fireplace. I'm going to help him as soon as we get Mr. Kendall inside. It took some doing. Even with the three of them, Winona had Evelyn strip the quilt off the bed and then deposited the unconscious man on it. She examined his wound, agreeing with her husband's assessment. Unless it was tended quickly, their friend would die. Zach, ride to the lake and fill the water bucket. We'll need a lot. Lou, bring me the towels from the corner cupboard. Evelyn, I need those roots we dug up earlier and the medicine bag. The girls bustled to comply, but Zack frowned. He wanted to go help his father. A no was on the tip of his tongue, but he swallowed it and rushed out. Winona sat on the bed and gently pried Scott Kendall's eyes open. The pupils were dilated, always a bad sign. His pulse was slow, his temperature high. In her mind's eye, she flashed back to when She was 14, to the time a male cousin received a horrible gash on the temple from a war club in a battle with the Sioux. The healers had done all they could, but her cousin hadn't lasted a week. Evelyn brought the leather pouch. How is he? We might lose him, Winona admitted. See, this is just what we were talking about, Mom. How could God let bad things happen to good men like Mr. Kendall? Winona put a hand on her daughter's shoulder. Your father would say that accidents happen, that life isn't perfect, that one of us could step on a rattlesnake tomorrow and die. Not because God wanted us to step on it, but because we were in the wrong place at the wrong time. She paused. My people would say that good and bad have both been with us for as long as there have been people. That Coyote, the father of the Shoshones, the trickster, as we call him, has given us much that is good, but also delights in causing much mischief. But what did you say? Winona chose her next words carefully. Life is a gift, little one. We are born. We live as many winters as we are given, and we die. That is how it is, how it has always been, how it will always be. Evelyn started to speak, but Winona touched a finger to her lips to shush her. Let me finish, please. The journey we make from the cradle board to the grave is not an easy one. There are moments of great joy, and when you were born, it was a joyous moment. There are moments of great joy. There are moments of great sorrow. And when your uncle was killed by the other Indians, there are good things and there are bad things. We don't always plan for them to happen, they just do. Winona pointed to the bookshelf. In your father's holy book, it says that the great mystery makes the sun rise on the evil and on the good, and sends rain on the just and the unjust. The sunshine and the rain fall on all of our heads, and we must take each as they come. Do you see now? Yes, thanks. Setting down the medicine bag, Evelyn went to get the roots by the wash basin. Winona shook her head in amusement. That was it? She supposed that she shouldn't be surprised. Children were much more open than adults, much more willing to take a teaching to heart without quibbling over a little detail. Oh, Evelyn would digest what they had talked about and pose more questions later on. But for now, the child was satisfied, and Winona should be too. Suddenly, the bed began to shake, convulsing. Scott Kendall was convulsing. His back arched, his arms and legs shaking like trees in a chinook. She pressed on his shoulders, but it was like trying to hold down a bucking stallion. What's the matter? Louisa cried, running to help. What's wrong with them? It was readily apparent. Scott Kendall was dying.